What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on the podcast is Aizaiah Yong, and we're going to have a powerful, exciting conversation about the counterintuitive wisdom that he gained through a near-death experience. What if our culture's approach to trauma and healing is fundamentally backwards? Instead of individual recovery, what if transformation is actually relational, communal, and intercultural? Aizaiah Yong learned this the hard way through a motorcycle accident that nearly killed him, a 16-hour surgery where he spent most of the time sitting in silence by a river with Jesus. Yeah, exactly. Well, today he shares how that experience is reshaping how he thinks about trauma, community, and spiritual transformation. This is a personal, but also a deeply intellectual conversation about the mystical openings to faith that he discovered in an intense crisis, recovery, and what you gain by hanging out with Jesus. Anyway, thank you, Aizaiah, for coming on, sharing your story, and I hope you all enjoy it. And know this, Aizaiah's going to be hanging out with us at Theology Beer Camp. So if you want to meet him in person, if you got a cool story like this to share with him, then come hang out with us there this October in St. Paul, Minnesota. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is Aizaiah Yong, author of Trauma and Renewal Towards Spiritual, Communal, and Holistic Transformation. And I'm pretty excited. You're like all grown up and stuff.
This is an honor to be with you, Trip. I'm real happy to be here on the podcast. Been a fan for a long time, so this is real exciting.
But I feel like you and your dad now are the first parent-kid that have both been on the podcast. It's kind of like LeBron getting to play with Bronny or something.
Well, I appreciate the Lakers reference. I won't make any evaluation on LeBron or Bronny in response, but it's pretty cool to be a parent-son, a father-son duo on the podcast. Never put that together, so that's pretty special.
I know. How many other epic theologians are going to have epic theologian kids that also want to hang out with me on the internet? I don't know.
Hopefully there's more to come.
Yeah. Come on. So, we met a long time ago before you had even started your PhD, but this book, the origin story of it starts at an almost ontological moment of transcendence for graduate students, passing your comprehensive exams. For those of you that haven't been in a PhD program, when you show up in America, this isn't true in European PhD programs, they give you a giant list of books, and they say, hey, in a few years, after you learn some foreign languages and take a lot of classes and have already written more than people in Europe write for their entire PhD program, you're going to be stuck in a room for a series of 4 or 5 hours, multiple days in a row, to write essays on random questions from a giant list of books and areas. And then when you get done, all of these professors you spent years with are going to grill you for a couple hours about mine turned out into 40 single space pages on 19th and 20th century philosophy of religion, these kind of things. And then they decide if you have to go write a paper on any topic that you covered because it wasn't good enough, you have to start over, or they're just going to tell you what's wrong with your dissertation proposal and clap for you. And when you get through this event, it's more of like surviving is thriving. When they tell you you're good to write a dissertation, it is the closest experience to your ordination or your wedding. You're I have just spent a huge chunk of my young life in being told you get to write a dissertation. Now it happened. And then what happened, Aizaiah?
Yes. Well, after I was coming home on my motorcycle from Claremont to Anaheim, California on Highway 55, for those of you who know the area in Southern California, I was on the phone, actually, Bluetooth headset with my mother, telling her about surviving this experience, and was completely blindsided by a Ford F-150 truck in the lane right next to me, who was thinking they were going to avoid an accident in rear-ending the person in front of them, swerved to my lane and just got the back of my motorcycle bike. And I went down about 30, 40 yards, was left in the middle of the lane, and could hear the cars kind of going past me. And Of course, it was just in the snap of a finger and a blink of an eye. It changed my life, and so thankful in that I survived. Number one, which I'm lucky for that. But number two, the people who stopped to help me. It was a recently immigrant couple from Egypt who were newly married, a Muslim couple who came, were the first ones to stop and actually park their car horizontally in the lane in front of me so that no cars could come and hit me. But also, we're also there waiting with me until the help came. And then also a motorcyclist, a Jewish man from Lebanon, came to the side and helped do a tourniquet on my leg. I don't think he was a medical professional, some kind of just response to the bleeding that was happening in my leg. And the three of them together, a Christian pastor left on the road for dead, had three strangers come and meet with me and keep me alive. And so I'm so thankful for their courage and for their paying attention in the moment to life and to giving themselves to that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the thing I really enjoyed about this book is, or maybe not enjoyed is the right thing, but like the energy of it, it's tackling both like the trauma of that entire journey of recovery, where your deep personal experience, both in recovery, in the surgery, and these kinds of things, are the whole book is looking at this question of trauma and renewal, but setting it what you learned in contrast to the very kind of individualistic narrative of both selfhood and transformation that so much of like the Western imagination's been trapped in.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, when you turn to tell something that's both a kind of a constructive academic work and a deeply personal one, when did that story of that traumatic event and what came after it become a story you wanted to share in a text, and not just like the wisdom of it, and then on occasion you let a friend in on the story or something like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, appreciate the way that you're inviting me to share on this publicly, because it was never an intention to share any of this publicly, to be honest. Not only was the suffering immense and unbearable at many occasions, but it's one of the things that, it's difficult to continue to live your life. I still live with the chronic, disability in my leg. There's many occasions that I'll be reminded sensationally and also memory and emotionally about what I've lived through. And so, and who knows how long that will continue. But I remember one of my close friends who's a chaplain and has worked with a lot of people in hospitals and in ICU units, intensive care units, and emergency situations, and said, and I began to share with him a little of my experience as a friend would share an experience to a friend. And he said, I know you know this, but any gift that you feel you've received in this life is not just a gift for you, but is meant to a gift to be shared with the world. And so he says, I'm not telling you obviously what to do or how to do anything, but I want to invite you to think about what you shared with me is deeply transformative. And as someone who hasn't gone through this, but supports a lot of people who have gone through very serious things, or supports people who are supporting people who have gone through very serious things, I hope that you would consider sharing it. And so if it wasn't for really him instigating it, and for my own kind of journey and healing process, both personally, but in community, and that's really, like you said, what the book's about, is finding ways to be in community that could be more supportive. Because when you're on the healing path as a person, you notice the depths you go are also interwoven with the depths of others and where they're willing to go or not go. And so part of my own yearning to be in connection to myself, connection to what's happened, and to promote it in a life-giving way also meant that those who I love, those who are in intimate community with me, were having to navigate through this. And what happens when that's going on? How do we attend to that? How do we support each other? And for me, it was a lot through this memoir. Spiritual practice for me is writing, both in a theological sense, but also sharing stories. And so, me being able to actually sit down and write on this was a deeply spiritual practice I was just doing anyways. And so then now bringing it into a way where I can share it in some particular way with the world. I'm thankful to Collegeville Institute, which invited me to a writing workshop in support of about 8 or 9 others, where if it wasn't for that group and that time, I don't know how the process would have came forth, but it was in community that I was able to share initially some of these pieces and get feedback, and then really put it out there in the world. And so I'm really, it's still kind of wild that it is actually out there so publicly, something that's so close to my heart. But the hope is that there might even just be one thing in the story that can unlock and open up something in someone else or in our communities about what the healing path can look like relationally.
Yeah, I remember, when your bike accident happened, learning about it from your parents on the
Hmm.
internet, a
Hmm.
nice little parasocial relationship. And you immediately, at least this happens for me, when you hear about this, whether it's like friends, people in your congregation, these kinds of things, you have that multi-perspective experience, right? Like, because I think it was your mom or dad that shared it first, I think of what would I be going through if I was on the phone when one of my kids were in a wreck on Los Angeles, and that experience. And then thinking of our relationship and going from peak celebration to, am I going to die? Right. And not knowing the status of what's going on, until you catch up. It's not like you're going to go texting parents in a crisis, be like, so how's Isaiah doing? And so you're just left there at this kind of like uncertainty, this unknowing. You're
Hmm.
praying for people that you care about, and knowing you had, a new kid around that time,
Yeah.
and that kind of stuff. All those bits were just in my own experience. And then reading the book, one of the things I loved about it is yes, it's your personal journey of trauma, and it's your family's experience as caregivers, not just your family, but others. But that shapes this core conviction that runs through the book, that trauma transformation is relational, spiritual, communal, and intercultural. And it moves beyond this kind of individualistic or sanitized approaches to healing that dominate our world. And so I kind of wonder, when you think of all the kind of narratives and stories that are there, when did you first kind of come to this deep
Hmm.
problematic vision of healing, like come to awareness of the deep problematic version of healing that's so rampant that your own experience kind of pushed you beyond, or grew beyond, and you're inviting us into it in the book.
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple things that come to mind that were helpful for me in terms of putting this together just in my own personal way. I think the first thing is, part of my doctoral studies was in mysticism and contemplative practice, and particularly, interreligious spirituality. And so through Raimon Panikkar. And so
Yeah.
how our spiritual experience is the resource and the core of how we can continue to transform and create in the world. And so I was already thinking about that question, as well as in relationship to, psycho-spiritual healing modalities, internal family systems. And so I'm a trained level 2 practitioner in this therapeutic modality, which has very spiritual foundations that are very often left out in the trainings for various reasons. But what I loved about both the teachings of the mystics, as well as this psycho-spiritual practice of healing, was the attention to our embodied experience, was the attention to the wisdom in which the difficulties of our experience can contain. And so, how do we assume a posture of being curious and compassionate towards what most of the world deems as wrong or problematic or evil or should be rejected? And so, how do we begin to touch those places? And when you go through, when I went through something as traumatic and as near death as I did, the old models that people look at and say, well, you can do this, you could do that, all that gets kind of thrown out the window, because now there's such a rupture of who you are at that moment that in some ways it's a total change of what's going to happen if you live through that. And so for me, there were these threads that were already opening up that I now had to look at in a whole different way. And part of that difference was this recognition that who I am as a person is much more than an individual.
Yeah.
Who I am as a person is connected to the ancestral wisdom, the lineages that I come from, the experiences of my parents and my grandparents and others, the chosen wisdom elders of the mystics that I was sharing. And then also these practices that help us to move beyond a one-on-one kind of hierarchical, the kind of typical therapist client relationship where the therapist can diagnose and has the answer and the client just kind of depending on them. Well, IFS is really this kind of harmonizing practice where, and a practice of mutuality where the practitioner is really there to give a support to a spiritual way of being that's not the answer, but helps open up the other person to that place inside of themselves. So the best IFS work is really helping all of us to attend to the wisdom in our personal experience, which is profoundly relational and not individualistic. And that's where this idea of how do I really lift that up, even in the IFS community? How do we lift this up in our theologies if we're deconstructing supremacist versions, monocultural versions, monolingual versions? How does our healing, because we're not going to continue to be present to the things that are being called to be present if we're only taking one path. And so that's where we need each other. And that's where we need this openness of faith, a life of faith to that which is maybe outside of what we thought was possible to then speak to us in a fresh way. And so it's the place where kind of spiritual direction and psycho-spiritual work and theology and our cultural change work, where they all touch each other. And how do we then not do that in isolation? Because it doesn't happen in isolation anyways, as much as we try to act like it does. And so this book was really inviting my parents and saying, I could tell my story in my words, and that's great. But there's so much to the story in your words and from your perspective, and me asking you questions and you asking me questions and missing each other and getting it right sometimes and going back to the fall and healing again and again. Well, I couldn't do that without them as my caregivers, as well as them and what I've inherited from them, both the very beautiful things and both things that are in ongoing need of compassion and curiosity. And so that's where I wanted to invite them into that. And kudos to my parents, because it's not easy to do this kind of process. And there were many times, of course, we would stop and we would pause and we would say, okay, get some individual support, get some support outside of the relationships. But how can we then at least bear witness to the fact that the healing we're all looking for is not going to be just found by ourselves, kind of walking our own, unique lives alone, our uniqueness in relationship, in connection, and how there's a mutual transformation.
Mm-hmm. In the first part of the book called Witness, there's a number of different kind of moments. And one of them, you talk about the nature of radical unknowing that trauma survivors often face, where, it leads to these kind of feelings of being lost and alone. And in that chapter, you make these connections between that experience of a radical unknowing and the contemplative tradition. And not just for the individual, but for the collective. And it's there early on where you kind of argue for a community-based spiritual approach to transformation, where individuals and groups learn to move beyond fear and isolation to that shared journey of healing. And I, as someone that was already a lover of the contemplative prior to that experience, how did that concept of this radical unknowing find new purchase in relationship to this trauma that shows up in your life?
Yeah, this sense of unknowing really is something that to what you were kind of lifting up earlier, the kind of Western individuated selfhood. Really, I mean, it's like the worst thing, right? It might as well be the devil. It is a sense of unknowing, a sense of vulnerability, a sense of question, a sense of kind of the despair that comes from not having a certain response to things. And so the contemplatives, of course, attest and witness to a knowing that has no response, right? But is a knowing in silence, a knowing that is invisible, a knowing that is subtle, but is foundational, but cannot be named, will refuse to be named. And so thus you have the apophatic tradition and all the things that we know about the mystery by saying it's beyond what we can say. And I've always read those kinds of things and wondered, I kind of don't know what they're talking about. And yet a part of me may relate to this. And as a kind of alternative to the solutions-based logocentricity of what I've inherited being born in the United States, being schooled in the education system here, of kind of the technocracy of solving problems and through observable patterns. Well, when you go to a sense of traumatic experience and unknowing, there's no more observable patterns to look at that point. You are in a kind of completely new space and place that I would even say, again, without support of others who have been to depths in that way, in their own way, you could, it might be the end of a person. And so there's a real, I really wanted to try to sensitively not spiritualize this immense amount of suffering or over spiritualize or romanticize, and yet say somehow in this experience for me, it did bring a certain embodied experience of this apophatic tradition towards me that now became illuminating to my own suffering in a way that I could actually be present to it and actually how do I say, open my life out of necessity in a lot of ways, it being in a hospital, but opening myself to others being present to me, even when I didn't know how to be present to me in that way. And so I talk about in the book a little bit of my struggles through that, the fears and concerns and just the overwhelming nature of it. And so it was the strangers, it was the nurses, it was the chaplains, it was the family members and friends who would just walk in, and even if it was just a little look on their face of, this is horrible, this is awful, there's nothing I can really do, but I'm here and you matter, and I'm glad I'm here with you. That really were graces in the midst of those initial hours. And so I want to say this with that question too, that it's not just this tradition that I was pulling from, but in the second part of the book where I talk about visions, is this mystical experience I encountered over 16 hours in the long surgery. And I think part of what I share in the first section is, of course, in the aftermath of going through a long journey of this kind of uncertainty and unknowing, this mystical encounter, as well as then bringing them to dialogue with other mystics to say, okay, where in my experience do I connect? Where in my experience is there something different? And how can I tell it in the unique way myself and my community has lived through it? And so part of, I guess, what I'm saying is in response to your question, it's not something I would have put together, of course, in the throes of things, but it's something that I've learned to see present in the ongoing healing journey and community, to recognize how some of those things were perhaps connected.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I wonder if you could give a little bit of a framework for internal family systems theory for people that don't know it, especially like in chapter 2, where you talk about the notion of self-leadership and that witnessing with dash ness dash ing. And if you can get 2 dashes in a word, that's like easily legitimate student loans. So, but you mentioned internal family systems before, so I just kind of like giving a framework for it and how that dynamic of both self-leadership and witnessing plays out.
Sure. So internal family systems was founded by Richard Schwartz in the 80s, who was a family systems therapist, and began to recognize that as much work as he could do with somebody in attending to the family dynamics, the larger family system, that was perhaps not being as supportive as it could be to a person and their mental health and well-being. You recognize that there's not just an external family that one has to consider, but there's an internal family. And so that there's a multiplicity of self and psyche that is experienced in a person, in all of us. And he came to this through talking to people and about what they were going through. And they would say things like, well, a part of me really wants to do X because it feels like that would be a helpful response. But another part of me thinks that doing the thing I just said would be the worst idea, and it would be unhelpful because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And so there had to be a way to bring this inner polarization into connection, into harmony. And so rather than demonizing either part, it was about how can we assume a stance of listening to the wisdom that the many parts of us inside have. And so that's why the model is radically non-pathologizing. And so it's affirming that although there may be wounding and harmful manifestations of our parts based on their perceptions, that there is a wise core to every part of our life that desires something, if we were to use theological language, holy or sacred for us, for our good and for the world. And so the question is, how do we listen to the parts inside? How do we be in relationship, in reverence to the parts inside, so that they can be expressed in harmonious and life-giving ways? And so the self in IFS is really that core. It's that core wisdom. It's that untarnished sense of knowing that no matter what a person has been through is present in all of us. And so there's a way to then, through connecting to one's self-leaderships, one's self-energy, using the language of internal family systems, we can then skillfully and winsomely articulate the wisdom of our parts, but live it out in meaningful, creative ways. And so IFS is this real, and of course, as someone who really takes pluralism of the divine in a Trinitarian sense, but also pluralism of religious paths in the mystical sense very seriously, the internal family systems paradigm really resonated. Also being a multiracial intercultural person, Chinese, Malaysian, Mexican, American, I'm very familiar with lots of different insights coming forth through my experience that don't necessarily always go together, that are in conflict. But what's the path to be able to heed those? And so with internal family systems and relating to trauma, typically we're going through experiences then that have very important information and wounds that they carry, of violations that have happened to us, dignity that has not been honored, ways in which we've suffered through a disconnection from people that were intended to love us, people that were intended to be there for us and protect us. And so internal family systems becomes a way, a portal, one portal of saying to a person, listen, what you've been through, there's truth. And yet what you long for in that process, there's a way to listen to that. There's a way to honor that. There's a way to then express oneself in a sense that's life-giving and honoring of your experience as well as others. And so that's what I think IFS is really about. So stories are really important for IFS practice. It's more than talk therapy. It's really, I see it as a spiritual practice of inner dialogue. And so when you're working with a practitioner, their main job is not to, to really give answers, but to be a compassionate and curious presence to increase the energy so that the person that one's supporting can find, again, reconnecting to that space in their own life and really listen to it in that way. And so it's a really quite radical practice. And when we train spiritual directors, therapists, or educators, really most people from walks of life, clergy, pastoral care providers in some of these ways, it's quite counterintuitive at first because it goes against the kind of sense of certainty and the kind of sense of we know exactly where this is going to lead, but it ends up in the long run being way more sustainable and fruitful in people's lives because they're really coming to this wisdom that was always there, but being able to really integrate it in a new, profound way for each person.
You talk about there's this temptation when thinking or trying to process our trauma that we either come up with creative ways of avoiding it, or we kind of come up with ways of interpreting them that ultimately are superficial, right? And this kind of like repress them or don't acknowledge all that's there. And you invite the reader to think about befriending them, to create pathways for a kind of deeper spiritual and communal healing. And that in that activity of befriending, right, you're actually coming to affirm life in a deeper way by tending to those traumatic and painful and suffering moments. And which, titling a chapter "Befriending the Tears," like you kind of have to write the chapter if you have the title like that. But I mean, in the book, you do both thinking of your own experience, but also serving as an invitation. So I wonder, what was it like to learn to befriend that your own trauma, and what have you seen as a practitioner in helping others kind of move beyond those kind of temptations to avoid or keep as superficial the trauma people carry?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a lifelong question, Trip, that you're asking, I think. And that's one of the things that I appreciate of, let's say, the great tradition teachers, is that there's really a sense of compassion for us learning how to do that and kind of falling along the way as we do that. And I think that's kind of the befriending spirit, is really humanizing that this doesn't happen in a linear fashion. This doesn't happen and that's why I wrote the afterword the way that I did, because I really didn't want to present a kind of tell-all, a kind of final solution to any of these things, but more so this invitation to begin again and to kind of return to a tending posture over and over. Now that the accident's been 7 years ago, there's still days I wake up and I feel like, have I even tended to this at all? Is this even really been changed in my life? I mean, that's the real experience. And so rather than trying to tell this hero's journey of, okay, I've moved through it, I'm so great now, everybody can kind of, pray this way or do this thing. Like I don't think that that's even possible. And, if we're taking Confucian wisdom seriously, how these experiences take us into connection and solidarity with the world. Well, we're in a moment where there is an immense amount of suffering and unknowing and violence and harm that's taking place. And so for me, even when things are coming back up in my own experience that feel very tender, this befriending process becomes an invitation to then say, how can my life be open to the world as it continues to go on through this as well? Thinking of Guan Yin, of course, which is an important, compassionate teacher in different Asian traditions, but as one who says, I will not go to the enlightened state until the last person is able to experience this. And I will go back to befriend and return to the suffering and to be present to it. There's a kind of, we could say divine wisdom, kind of perhaps even a divine feminine dimension to this process that I feel is, again, very, because of patriarchy and colonial systems of oppression, been marginalized from our spiritual traditions that are there and present. And so for me, this befriending process was now about listening to other voices, was now finding other teachings that were marginalized, whether it be the mystics, the prophets, the social change leaders, whether it's those in our society today. Shout out to the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, my pastor, Bishop Yvette Flunder, who's just an amazing example of how we can see the tradition going so deep, and yet at the same time, really befriending what the world says we should discard, we should get rid of, we should reject. But no, there's a wisdom here. And of course, that's biblical, right? The stone that the builders rejected is the chief cornerstone. And so how do we then turn to a posture that befriends our inner experiences in that way, the social communities in that way? And then we could even think about, in this moment, the earth, because the earth is our parent. The earth is our extended body. All the different wisdom traditions will talk about it in many different ways, but we look at the earth as something less than, something to kind of be superior to, right? And so there is this befriending even of how do we listen to the earth? And of course, Panikkar talks about ecosophy, the wisdom of the earth, not about the earth, but in being in relationship to the earth as our body. And so not at Claremont, but in many other places that I was taught theology and spiritual practices, these are the dimensions that we couldn't befriend, that were not open and accessible. And so my own journey of walking through this experience helped me to more fully embrace some of the wisdom that comes from both inside my experience that feels really difficult, the pain and the rejection and the questioning, but also then how to then heed that as it is unfolding in many different contexts in the world. I see them as deeply interwoven and interconnected.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense that both for our internal kind of self-understanding and in our relationship and understanding of the community we belong to, there are these temptations to ignore or repress or trivialize the depth of relationships in that whole kind of web of life. And befriending is like simultaneously an internal and an external journey that you really, which later in the book, when you talk about kind of the all-encompassing love of the divine, that internal and external journey is complicated, or there's a kind of porousness of being that reframes what in our normal kind of inherited Western Eurocentric vision is either just a journey inward or just a journey outward of the self. But when the grounding of the self and all and our wholeness is in this web of kind of divine immanence, then the befriending it doesn't have this kind of cross pressure in the same way.
That's really well said. And, I feel like this is really, it's moments like trauma, for those of us who have lived with disabilities, for those of us who have marginalized identities, different backgrounds, whatever that may be, class, education, nationality, language, right? So gender, sexuality, so on and so forth, race, right? There's many others. But it's how do we then turn to see what has been thought of and discarded and excluded as something then welcome and can be transformed, both as it's in relationship, that, that which was thrown out could transforms us, but then there's a mutuality, right? There's a mutual enrichment that comes through this befriending posture, but it's quite a kind of against the stream way of being. And so Panikkar, to quote him, he would say that for him, the image that he would get in kind of the contemplative life would be that it's a fish that is consciously swimming upstream, but is doing so with elegance. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it's that feeling where you're living in such a way where you can befriend and be open to really this fullness of life in a kind of way that affirms and is part of the ongoing transformation as a kind of celebratory experience. And when I say celebratory, I don't mean happy or like good. I'm talking about this kind of greater whole. And so it doesn't always feel good, actually, at all when you're doing that. And so I think that's part of where the spiritual part of it is so important, that even goes beyond just the psychological, which is still very, very important. but it's how do we then find ourselves returning to that posture or that orientation to be available to that which is perhaps in some ways beyond what we can see or perceive. So there's so much to learn and share from each other about living through this that I think we often miss in terms of the way our churches are structured, in terms of the way we do education, in terms of the way we even talk about healing. And so I hope it seems like what I'm sharing through a story and writing it even with my parents, it's less, the guidebook, and it's more like an invitation to look inside our own paths of where might we be discarding or rejecting energetic wisdom that is present within us and around us that we've been taught to fear, to hate, to demonize, to exclude. And how do we begin to reconnect in a curious way, in a compassionate way? I think the more that we do that and the more we hear of others doing that, we can have new possibilities for life together. And we can even discipline ourselves to not keep living in the ways of our initial reactions.
Yeah. If the first part of the book is looking at the, this experience of trauma and reorienting that, because you're kind of processing it. The second part, it centers around your vision during surgery, and which, look, telling a story like that to your friends is one thing, putting it in print is another. And I was sitting there trying to think of, do I have other friends that are like, yeah, that time I talked to Jesus in an academic book? I can't think of them. Plenty of us report on other people that do it, but both sharing it and then processing it, and not even just processing it on your own, right? But in this more communal context. So I'd love for you to kind of both tell whatever part of the story you think is important in the vision to that they go like, yeah, like I couldn't just tell you how I metabolize this experience in the book. I have to actually share some of the experience to even tell you what I've gained or learned.
Right. No, absolutely. And, one of the things I love about the book is, my father's response to me talking about this vision to him at first, and his wrestling with, is this the drugs? Is this just pain? What's going on? But then growing up as a
Yeah.
Pentecostal himself, he's like open to the fact that there are visionary experiences. And then the question of discernment, which is, okay, Isaiah's sharing this interesting experience with all of us, but yet the fruits that seem to be coming from what he's sharing are full of the presence of the divine. And so that is a kind of way of discerning these experiences. And of course, different mystics will also tell you, to beware of the different visionary experiences you have, and to let them go in some cases, or to just not pay attention to them, because you can easily deceive yourself. And so I want to say something like, it's a difficult question. And yet at the same time, it's very undeniable for me that when I was in this liminal space between life and death, 16-hour surgery, on the brink of wherever this connection is between what we experience and other things that are present in reality, I feel I was there. And to me, my grandmother even said, when I told her about what happened, she said, well, it's not a mistake that Jesus was the one who showed up. And so I said, okay. But I can only say that what I experienced in that vision, and of course I detail some of it in this short book. I mean, there's so much I didn't write. And so there's a whole process of what to share and why. But what I can say is that profound encounter of tasting the befriending, of savoring in a witness that saw me fully and completely amidst all the inconsistencies, all the hypocrisies, all the unresolved tensions of my heart and mind and body, and yet extended a sort of inner bow, a sort of inner, we're in this together, a sort of infinite beauty that was being perceived as part of my life, that was my life. That will change you in terms of how you begin to get the strength then to look at some things that are hard. And on better days, I feel more grounded to do that than other days. But that was the initial experience. And so being able to receive that kind of love, which I've had a number of really amazing spiritual experiences in my life, is something I've been sensitive to since I was a young child. But having this kind of meeting when you're in the midst of life and death, and having someone to be present with you, and to be with you, and to listen, and to tell jokes, which is one of the things was surprised me most about this encounter was how many jokes were being told about life. And, in my first reaction, I was honestly a little bit frustrated. I thought, well, there's so much suffering in the world and we're just here telling jokes. Like,
You're
what,
like, come on, Jesus.
like, you get serious, and there's real problems going on. And it was this sense of not running away, not dismissing, not abandoning the suffering, but being able to attend to it from a different depth, from a different sense of knowing and seeing. And so that is something I'll process the rest of my life. I wanted to tell the vision though, because you asked the question, what made you share it versus just write about some of the fruits that might have come and being able to encourage those. And for me, writing about an experience is one thing, but writing the words from that place and from that space inside of which I know of what that feels like, that was what was important. And so maybe I could have done it without sharing it, but it felt like if I was being honest, whatever I'm saying is not just it's not just really at the end of the day, my ideas, my hopes and those kinds of things. I mean, they're in there, but it's really about how do I share from what I saw, from what I witnessed, and stay in that way of not repeating it, but in that energetic feeling to be able to an experience, to be able to then communicate from that place. And that's my prayer still, is that as I live my life with God's mercy and grace, I will be able to live in a way that's connected to what I saw and witnessed. And so the last thing I want to say about it, which I think isn't obvious from the book, but it's there, is that what the majority of the vision was for 16 hours was literally sitting in silence at a river next to Jesus, not talking, not planning, not acting, not crying, not smiling, just being in relationship with life as it is also being. And that was really the core of everything else. And so there's this, if we're taking Taoism seriously, this non-activity, the Wu Wei. And it was a sense of how to live as being available to the divine work as life is and entrusting what happens. And so that experience, I experienced so many moments of epiphany and transformation in the vision. But when I finished just sitting in silence at a river for the majority, I remember leaving and coming back out of the kind of time in silence with Jesus and saying, what just happened? Because I feel completely different. I thought you healed me before. And I thought I was already like strengthened before, but we did literally nothing. And I'm actually feeling completely different now. What happened? And all the response I got was, it's been a while since you've given yourself time to just be. And there's something about that contemplative dimension, which is a reminder that it's always available to us. And yet through distractions and other forces and pressures, we give ourselves to other kinds of, our attention to other things. But how do we then return to this posture is a question I continue to have. And I hope is the invitation as we attend to the suffering of our own lives, our communities, and of course the world.
Mm-hmm. When reading it, I mostly kept thinking of how many different opening lines and talks I could give involved the fact that I talked to Jesus. Like you're like, oh, have you ever been close to death and someone just said the complete wrong thing? And people will giggle. And then you're like, yeah. So one time, one of my friends, insert Jesus joke. And I'm like, really? I'm currently half dead right now. And you're like, but then it was Jesus. Or you make a joke where someone tells you the joke and you're like, Jesus Christ. No, I mean, it was him, like there are all those little elements, like that are sitting in it of like, what's going on? There's a sense of like the humor in things. Then there's like that deep, the silence and the presence that's there. And then there's that kind of, it kind of, the way I thought about it was like that sense of being was like a resonating one, right? Where you're kind of opening up to, or you usually experiencing the aliveness that's all there. It was like in the presence of Christ, there's a kind of attuning to depths and possibilities and resonance with the whole that's not there. And that experience that's taking place while your body is in surgery then kind of frames this sense of coming out of it, thinking about your own healing journey, and then the healing journey as a collective across creation that we need to go. And it seems to be like each of those little bits you experience in your journey are also challenges, right? Like that sense of being just in the presence of divine embrace, that sense of like humming with the rest of creation, expanding our boundaries, that sense of like, even in this deep tragedy, like one of the greatest gifts you get is a friend with a well-timed joke. That if you're not that friend, you don't get to tell that joke then, but because it was Jesus and you know that he shares in the fullness of our sufferings, like he has the permission to do it, and you give yourself permission to laugh because your own experience isn't foreign to him. So like anyway, I got done reading those middle chapters and thought, without wanting to break an arm or a leg, or like without the situation for it, like I wanted to have that like that deep palpable sense, and I felt like I would love to have had this conversation with Aizaiah. This is like really uncomfortable to think about telling this much of my experience publicly.
Yes.
And then talking to your theologian dad about it, you know, like that bit reminded me of what I say to friends that come with these altered state of consciousness experiences. Like I'm sitting there going like, well, I know technically I'm a Christian. Obviously, like process people should be totally into this. And I spend way too much time reading brain science. And also, like, you're a walking like skeptic and believer at the same time thinking about these experiences. So like the whole narrative of it, I just absolutely loved and have no idea what the question was coming from. What I was going to next. I wrote down questions, so I'll just look at them. I rarely do. Okay, here's one. So yeah, in that you have this intrinsic link between the personal healing and the healing of the whole. And in that space, you end up talking about, like, you bring up these narratives from Jesus' own public ministry, but do so where that trauma transformation is the thread you're tending to it. And so maybe you can talk about that, your own kind of experiential encounter with Jesus, and then the way the narratives the tradition contain that you carried with you into that experience, how they mutually informed each other and kind of opened up a vision out of it, you know, of how every being ultimately belongs. It was really cool exegesis of both like your own experience and the narrative of Jesus and all that kind of stuff.
Well, that's super generous. You know, like I say, it's an ongoing process and practice of not just healing, but interpreting one's life and sharing one's life. And we, again, back to community, back to communing with reality, because every time we share, we're sharing in a particular way with a particular person in a particular moment, right? And so your process, I know I'm getting amens inside from you. And yet at the same moment, there is a thread. There are these threads that allow us to be creative and to try and to fail and to move in ways that we didn't anticipate. And so I think part of not only my experience personally and then the vision, but really, you know, my relationship with Jesus. And I want to go on the record and say, I feel very grounded and connected to Jesus as a Jewish rabbi, as a mystic, as a social prophet, as someone whose life opened up possibilities for the human family in a unique way that I'm so grateful for and I feel so connected to. I feel to really follow him and take him seriously, we get to actually speak to our own communities and traditions with prophetic invitations, with spiritual sense of embodied knowing, with a willingness to be in connection to all those we thought we could not be in connection with, and to do things we never dreamed possible. To me, that feels very traditional. And so in being connected to Jesus's life and ministry, it really allowed me to see, to give me the courage to face my own life, in a new way of both embracing the cultural identities, the intergenerational wounds and insights, the unresolved things. And so part of looking at the scriptures and how Jesus walked with the disciples and how he shared of himself, that was really what was driving it, saying, can we look at life, Jesus's life, in this mystical sense? Can we look at Jesus's life as he's calling those around him to live their own lives more deeply and fully, as Jesus is inviting people to be more honest and to begin again and to confront the very unspeakable aspects of experience with connection and compassion. And so all those stories that I lifted up there, and there were others I had to leave out, of course, there's many more, but it was just my way of saying, no, Jesus's example this tradition, this person, really, this lived experience that this person walked and had in some way. And in some ways, I don't even understand it at all. And yet there's something about when he lived and what he did that is still offering us resource and empowerment and hope to live our moment in our lives in unique, creative ways. And I remember in the vision when I would keep referring to Jesus as master, both because I'm thinking, well, it's Jesus, because it's obvious that he's done something really significant.
Plus, if you're not sure if you're near death or not, it's a good time to have a higher Christology. You know,
Well,
you're like, look, I got a spectrum of possibilities here. It's a good time to lean big.
well, but here's so that was the response, the natural response of being in the presence of this person. And yet what his response was is why do you call me master? Like, we're friends. And I'm thinking, come on, like, yeah, we're friends, like, doing the whole nice thing, making me no, but like seriously, but like, no, seriously, like, we're in this together. I don't, and I don't know how else to explain how transformative that is when you see someone that you esteem in the highest regard possible, when you feel you are witnessing, you're experiencing a presence that transforms everything around in the deepest way, the most lasting, eternal way, telling you we're in this together. Come on, right?
Yeah.
And I think
it has that resonance both like in the synoptic tradition of why do you call me good? Only the Father's good. And then in the Gospel of John, well, I call it the crescendo of the New Testament, is when he says, I no longer call you servants, right? Master, but friend. But it's we tend to think that hierarchical framing for the Christ is peak Christology, when the highest Christology of the gospel, the one where Logos is in sandals, is like, no, you don't get it. I no longer call you even servants, but friends. There's this deep intimacy of the divine life, but that most intimate of language is in the gospel with the highest Christology. And you see that, right? Like even in other mystics, I mean, you talk about them in the book, but I mean, if you go through the list of them in the Western tradition,
right.
where all of a sudden Jesus is a lover, all of a
Yes.
sudden, like you're sitting in his wounds, all of a sudden, like there are all these ways in which contemplative experiences have a kind of radiant transcendence that erupts into this kind of imminent, a kind of palpability of the divine, that problematizes a real kind of distancing, of Christ as other.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, that's amazing connections, because I don't think I wrote about either of those in the book. So I should have got your feedback before I put those in there. But
yeah, you're grounded. Yeah.
I was gonna, I feel like having both the mutuality, but the sense of how do I put this? Just belovedness, right? If we go at the very core, and this was Thurman's response to the civil rights and to the social problems. It says we need new policies, we need material changes. Yes, all these things have a place and are important and are very critical. And at the core, if we don't all ground ourselves in a unique experience of belovedness that we can share and honor in one another in the diverse ways we can do that, this is not going to last at all. And so having this sense of belovedness in my own life, perceiving the gift of your own life that we miss, all of us, the fact that we're here is not only miraculous, but is kind of infinite. It's an infinite experience in some way now, being in this little, time bubble that we all get to be here, but it's all there. And it's one thing to hear about others tell you that and say, well, that sounds cool. I don't know what you're talking about. And that's kind of when I would read the mystics, a lot of the experience. But then it's another thing to then have a vision where you're going, oh my God, like I've now seen the depths of my own problems and challenges. I've seen the depths of suffering that Jesus encountered and endured. And yet I'm seeing the preciousness still present, shining through somehow in this. That is something that it will change you forever. And then not just looking at my life and those suffering, but even those we could call enemies. And I won't go down the path today where so much of the vision continued to push me to perceive this reality in the places and the people that I would prefer not to practice seeing that reality with. But it was that kind of way of gift that Jesus moved. And that, at least in my experience and what I tried to invite us to in the world, is to say that we belong to each other. We are in this together, and that it's not just about heroes' journeys. but we're friends. We are kin together. And so how can we open ourselves up to that possibility? And that's what I think is critical. It's urgent, and yet it's kind of simple, but it requires a unlearning of so many of the patterns and socialized norms that we've inherited.
Hmm. Yeah, it made me think of like even a different way of seeing, you know, the parable in Matthew 13 on like the pearl, a great price, where often interpretations kind of don't have as background this kind of thick aliveness of existence that's to be cherished, right? And when you think of the kinds of things that trauma, both individual or collective, do to our vision, so many times it can make us think we're just a victim of the past, or we're just the sinner who caused X, or we have a future that is collapsing, and we get all of our anxieties poured to the unknown in the presence. And, you know, part of your vision, one of the things that kind of really shook me is this sense that all of the things about the past or the future that could, you know, in many ways seem like legitimate concerns were not what Jesus was tending to. He was tending to you in that very present, and sat there in the presence with you, like until the present became all that's necessary to receive, learn, and grow from, right? And so like it makes you think of like, what is, you know, the pearl of great price? What does it mean to like show up and tend the kingdom of God? Is like setting aside all this energy and intention we do with managing the past and the future, and becoming kind of porous and receptive to the full gift of what's already there, right? The kingdom of God is within you, and these kind of things.
Well, you know, it's funny that we talked about brain science a little bit, because, you know, and now I'm hanging out with these Benedictine monks and the women religious here, which are absolutely amazing, at the Abbey at St. John's and St. Ben's Monastery.
And they have a sense of humor similar to Jesus. This is my experience, is until you hang out with people that have taken vows, you don't understand just what's possible.
And that's very true.
It just
takes a lot possible.
Takes one time with bourbon and nuns in a hot tub to realize just how middle school boys aren't the only ones with middle school boys' sense of humor.
You know, I can't wait to hear that story at another time.
Yeah, not on a recording.
we have an amazing community here, and you know, when they take the brain scans of people who've been practicing meditation, contemplative practice for a long time, you know, they'll show you how the patterns are very similar to people who are asleep, you know, in the best parts of sleep. And we talk about what is the fullness of this pearl, what is the fullness of this experience, and being so available. And you know, when we're asleep, we're really available because we're not doing all the things that we love to do to distract us. And we're kind of in this very kind of childlike wonder being asleep. And of course, there's all the dream work and the Jungian and all these kinds of things. And I try to gesture a little bit at this sense of visions, not just the kind of ecstatic, but dreams and other ways of kind of, how do I say, this fullness of experience that's available. And that's what I think I wanted to highlight, is just to say that, you know, a practice of Lectio Divina, a practice of being in nature, a practice of being really present to our children doing arts, because I got young children who love to do art. You know, all these things are these little breakthroughs of fullness if we're really available for them to perceive one of this mystery and this life that's here, this pearl, this gift that will never be repeated, has never been and never will be repeated, but also we get to dance with, we get to actually speak to, right? It's not like we're just, so we start off receptive in it and not our own agendas. That's the contemplative posture. But then in being receptive, we get to play with it. We get to literally alter, try it out, see what happens, see the impacts of that. And ultimately, hopefully, in the sense of obedience, which is kind of, whoa, don't talk about that in our culture. Obedience to what? To who? To why? This obedience to love and to life for the flourishing of life, not to some one being out there that's saying this or that, but to this cosmic, divine, if we were talking to Panikkar, he would say cosmotheandric experience, that we would participate in the affirmation and the celebration of it all. And so then our response becomes the humor. Our response becomes the sitting with the sorrow, the crying tears that won't stop, as some of the prophetic traditions will tell us about. So all these aspects then become this pearl. They become dimensions of the pearl. And the different cultural and spiritual traditions, they give us insights on how to be present to the pearl. And so that's what I want to say. I'm talking about something very traditional in the gospel that Jesus is pointing to, but yet Christians and all of our tradition, all the diversity of it, cannot express by itself. And it never has, by the way, from Irenaeus and Origen and others that were engaging other ideas. The beauty of the religious traditions is that they're present to the world, that the world speaks to it, and that they say something new for right now. And so this is very faithful to what we're called to do. It's the invitation to go out to the world and proclaim this mystery, and that we get to do it by listening mostly and being present mostly to the languages and experiences that seem out of the box, so that we can be in connection and deepen this experience of the pearl together.
Yeah.
And so I think that affirmation is what I'm trying to get to, and theologically, pneumatologically, but mystically, it feels so alive and resonant. And the more people I talk to from other traditions with a contemplative posture, we tend to be moving in the same direction. Maybe not the same direction, but there's a certain resonance and openness for this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the concepts you developed that I really enjoyed was how deep seeing, right? And how you kind of talk about these different circles of community and the way they relate. And you're obviously, it's coming out of your own experience of trauma and recovery and things, but then it becomes this framework of deep seeing that can address how communities can address and respond to other traumas, pain, and suffering. So can you, kind of describe how you use the parable of the Good Samaritan to see a kind of deep seeing and bring in these different circles of community.
Yeah, thank you for picking up that thread. I think there's a few different layers to it. The first layer, I think, is the kind of very personal layer, which would be the ways in which our own epigenetic makeup, our own cultural identities, and lived experiences as a unique person filter how we can engage the world. There's both beauty in that. It's kind of what allows us to be who we are. And in other ways, it can be very problematic. It can exclude or cancel out other experiences. And so there's a kind of a personal way we've all got to kind of account for that, examine our life and what that looks like. Then there's maybe the social, cultural aspect in which those filters come on. So you have your structural oppression, you have intergenerational dynamics that, again, none of us maybe that are alive were the decision makers, but we've certainly inherited what's happened. And so we have to account for that. So that then you start getting beyond just your own lived experience when you were born and when you're going to die, but now you're finding yourself connection to others, right? And I would put even in that the more than human, the earth, right? What is the earth saying and what's the earth speaking? And this is a larger body that we've now got to examine. So part of the deep seeing is both accounting for these things and finding ways to deepen and broaden what's possible coming in contact with. And so the personal level, at the social cultural level, we might even put the religious dimension in there, like our own religious tradition and what we've inherited with that and how we can keep going deeper and deeper to broaden and go into the depth so that those roots can open us up to others. And then the last level to me is, again, the mystical level. And I'm not talking about this in a hierarchy or anything like that. This one's better, this one's worse. They're all just there. But I think that one's important because that is the sort of, again, if we were to talk about silence or this place of listening, drawing on these Benedictine practice of listening from the heart, we're talking about assuming a sort of open spaciousness so that reality can be and express continuously. And rather than imposing all the time our own agenda or plans for it, we can now be in a sort of relationship that is edifying to ourselves and others, and all of life. And so I would say when we talk about deep seeing, it's both recognizing what we've been taught to see, what we've been trained to see, how we disrupt where we're encouraged to look. So this is, things like propaganda. They distract us. Things like algorithmic, patterns of super intelligence that move us into certain bubbles and corners and ways of being. And so we've got to learn on all those levels how those are limiting to our fullness of experience. And so how does it become a spiritual practice of resistance and also thriving to begin to open that up a bit. And so we could talk about the life of the mind and the intellectual traditions is one way of engaging this in that sense. But all of these practices are really about moving us into a deeper seeing. And so what I want to say is let's do it holistically and let's do it together. Let's be in conversation about it. Let's hear from others in other parts of the world and different tongues and wisdom traditions that can say, here's my personal encounter with trying to do this. Here's my social cultural context of trying to do this. And then here's my spiritual context from trying to do this. And we begin to put those together. And now when we tell those stories to one another, there's a depth of seeing that begins to not just tend to wounds that we thought would be there forever, that now actually there's ways to connect that are helpful. But I would say we actually realize this sense of our deepest yearning, which is this interconnectedness with life. And so then dialogue, and I don't mean just like sharing ideas. I mean encountering one another as beings, as full expressions of this mystery. How do we attend to each other in this way? How do we share about the journey of that? And I think that's the process of deep seeing in the Samaritan story. That's what's happening, right? Is this unlikely person is moving past the dominant scripts, is moving beyond the personal, the social, cultural, the religious, and even the spiritual, perhaps, sense of what is right here. And is saying, no, I'm going to be present and available to something very deep that may be transgressive to different ways that I have internalized, but because I trust myself to life, I'm going to go on this journey. And I think that's really this kind of redemptive, transformative way of being that the Samaritan story encourages us to live. That's never ending. And what a journey that is, and how amazing it is to find others who will encourage us to keep walking when we don't really know where it's going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it seems that, after that in the book, there's this, like, the next challenge that you take up is that need to destigmatize suffering and learning to kind of differentiate or kind of recognize just how powerful the wrong interpretation of suffering can be for locking in pain, suffering, oppression, these kinds of things. So I wonder, when you're thinking about the power of an expanded companionship and such beyond the kind of more individualistic models that we show up, well, like what are ways of kind of cultivating that non-judgmental presence that you talk about, the role and function of like consent in relationships around pain and trauma and stuff like that, and that ability to come alongside each other in the pain without that temptation that, especially for Western religions, I think we have a real tendency to both avoid pain and then assign blame when we see it. And so like the vision of companionship that I think developing is both addressing suffering, but also the way we stigmatize and narrate other people's suffering.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think if we were to take what Jesus did seriously, one of the things he did was hang out together and have a meal.
Yeah.
And actually just sit together and drink wine, have bread, and be present to the fullness of each other, right? And it is that deep companionship. I mean, really this is the night before he's dying, and like, that's what you want to do? I mean, I don't know, right? It just seems really like, if the strategic side of my mind says I would have done a lot of other things. I would have put a business plan together. I would have set up an endowment. I would have tried to work to preserving what we have here. But it's so simple that he's like, continue to eat together, continue to share of who you are and what you're sensing with each other. Be open to what each other are bringing in a sense of mutuality, in a sense of deep pain and fear. And they have the whole conversation where they're like, well, who's the greatest? I mean, the whole ego thing is going strong at that dinner, right? And so in other words, when we eat together, when we share life together, it's not the demonizing or problematizing of all the things that happen in our lives that we share, but it's a different way of being able to, we could even say, honor, invite, befriend, companion what's there. And that's where I'm saying, I think in a deep way, this deep wholeness, this deep fullness that we long for, it means developing capacities that we can be present to the fullness that is there, which includes the ego, which includes some of these things. Now, what I'm not saying is that anything goes. And what I'm not saying is that we just minimize things as they the problems that exist, and how we can do all that we can to do no harm and to be present, and yet still recognizing on this human journey, right, that it's really not about achieving this transcendent state where we float away, we demonize what's here, and it's really about letting our lives be broken open with it. And right, and that's what happens at the meal, is there's a breaking open together and remembering about what this is about. And so so being the disciples minister that I am, centering on an open table, an expansive table, an inclusive table, where justice and peace and the sense of curiosity towards one another is there, to me feels super important. And even out of the Christian frame, right, it's one of the best ways to promote a relationship is to invite or be invited to someone's home or to a meal together. It's a basic need we have, but it's when stories come, it's when you get to know more of a person than just their lecture. And I'm all for a good lecture, but honestly, I want to know how you eat, and I want to know how you are with living the human experience. And I think when we get to a place of being able to share each other about that, which is like honestly the most simple part of it, but it's actually the most profound if we're really present and available for it, which again, one of the distractions is to make us not available. So we're overworked. We're feeling like, we can't take time. People, when we go, you probably get this too. They always joke about people from the States, how when we go to events, it's like, why do you come here after it starts and you leave before it ends? Because you're going to another event. Why would you do that? Who, like that makes no sense. And yet it's so common because, well, we're on the go. We have another problem to solve. We find importance by, right, all these things. And so how do we then stop for a moment to enjoy the meal where we are, to enjoy the relationships that come? And then I'll say, like a good Pentecostal, to be open perhaps to the surprise and the emergence of what may be present in a situation that you didn't plan for. And perhaps that thing, like the Samaritan on the side of the road, is actually the reason you're there. You could not have put that in the agenda. And so I just want to say that's part of the companionship I'm talking about, is a way of living in deep relationship together that we can actually all practice. And I think from a justice perspective, we want to be the kinds of advocates so that housing, healthcare, education, these are human rights, human invitations, so that we can share in this way. If you're wondering about housing, you're wondering about healthcare and food, right? Then what I'm saying is not in some ways even possible, but how do we then begin to be the kinds of people that say, this is something for everybody, and we have just as much to share as much we have to learn from one another. And so that would be the heart of the companionship and the ongoing trauma transformation that I want to invite us to.
Yeah. Okay. So one more question, that how has both like the experience and this kind of processing it in conversation with those near you and things changed, like what have been the biggest transformations of the experience itself? Right? Like one of the threads through the book is that like even the divine showing doesn't show its resonance until you're like metabolizing it in conversations with people that know and love you, and with the ancestors that you read and are bringing their experience in. And this book is like one moment, right? In response, like one moment where this is what I gathered, and it's still present with you. So I'm interested in like, what is it like to keep tender the gift of the experience as you continue to process it, into conversations with people that read it and then are like, oh, now I'm talking to them about what it meant this one time when I finally put it to page.
Sure. I appreciate that question so much, both the relational side of me and in you, but also the ongoing journey and dance of life that we're in. So because it's always a new note. For me, what I get to do at the Cosmo Institute is really amazing and special, and I'm so happy to be here because I'm seeing how the experience I've lived through and the sense of how important a kind of contemplative grounding is to the kinds of ways we want to live in the world, the new monastic movements, those who find these hidden, really, I mean, the Benedictines here are quite large compared to a lot of other monastic communities, and have been historically, but in the big scheme of things, is a pretty small group of people just living. And I tell people, and it's like, what's it like to live, and work at a Benedictine monastery after all the things, kind of experience? And I said, well, it's like one great big subtle flex of experience, because there's such a depth and humility of fullness of expression together. And yet it's really not about anything other than being present to life and being open to life. And this really, all of it's structured to do that. And you're wondering, wow, for 1,500 years, they've been very committed to this and they've passed it along. What a gift to Western Christianity, of course, but what a gift to the world. And then what does that mean to find others who are those kinds of communities in the world? And so what I'm saying is that for what I get to do at Collegeville, it's an amazing place for reflection, for writing, for community building. But I think really the magic of it is the particular place where we are, which is in this community of a monastic community and sensibility, as well as kind of a deep hospitality, which is one of their hallmarks, for greeting others as though it's the divine presence. And so for me, that's how I was greeted in the midst of my traumatic experience as a divine being. I mean, really. And you're just amazed because you look at your own life and you say, no, like, I don't see it. And yet that's what was being shown to me. And so insofar as we can become people in whose presence others begin to feel the divinity, the love of their own lives in its ordinariness, in the stains on their teeth, in the stuff coming down their nose, like my kids often. How do we cultivate that way together? That's what I think is the kind of change of experience as it continues to deepen and expand. And that, of course, it's not just an experience I lived through, but how do we stay present to the deep ways in which the precious forces of this world deny or hide or invisibilize the divinity of others? If we think about what we're witnessing in this moment, in the massive violence and the ways that our community is complicit in this in the United States, these contemplative ways of living are totally subversive to that, because they want to make real, they want to make present the preciousness of those in the world. And how do we then come into community and honor that? How do we discipline and simplify our lives so that we are present to what's most vital and important? And so I think in that sense, that's the deepening thread, that I get to do this with others and more people. And when I invite people to come to Collegeville, it's in this spirit, it's in this posture, and to share it in their own way, but also to get to receive it from what's been being cultivated here with the Benedictines for the last 150 years. And before that, indigenous communities and how they've engaged this place and land. We want to continue to tell those stories and deepen our experience in those wisdoms.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for both the vulnerability to tell so much of that story in the book and to share today. And I'm super pumped we'll get to hang out in person at Theology Beer Camp. And is there a place you think we want to make sure to direct people if they want to learn more about what y'all are doing at the Collegeville Institute, follow your work and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, we have a newsletter that I'd love for people to sign up to. The link will be there, I'm sure, shared. Of course, for the book with Orbis, I'm so grateful for their support, and I hope that it can be a resource and encouragement for people in congregational life, for spiritual directors, for therapists, social workers, nonprofit community leaders, to bring those spiritual paradigms. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be in connection and to learn alongside the amazing community you have and what this healing journey can look like together.
Awesome.